Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's to cut through the noise, really analyze your source material, and get right to the heart of these complex issues. Today, we're tackling something really foundational. We're doing an intense deep dive into a core claim you hear a lot in interfaith discussions.
Right.
And that's the assertion that the Hebrew Torah, you know, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was somehow textually corrupted, altered, maybe even fabricated, somewhere between Moses and the arrival of the Quran in the 7th century AD.
Yeah, this claim, which we're calling pillar #1 for our analysis, it's really the absolute starting point, isn't it? If you assume the prior scripture is corrupted, well, the whole historical basis for religious continuity kind of dissolves.
Exactly. You can't trust the history if you can't trust the text it comes from.
Precisely.
So our objective here for you, the learner, is strictly analytical. We're not here to debate ultimate truth, not at all. We're doing a Steelman analysis, looking hard at the sources you gave us, mostly the Quran and the Hadith, to see what these texts themselves actually say about the Torah's integrity.
We're holding the material up, seeing if it holds together internally on this point.
So we start with one really focused question that frames everything. If this corruption happened, when did it happen?
That's the key. Because if the sources themselves can't clearly show corruption happened before the 7th century AD, then that whole argument about ancient corruption kind of falls apart. We have to follow the timeline given within the revelation itself.
And what's fascinating is that when you look closely, the Quran's own statements about the Torah in the 7th century give us a surprisingly specific answer about that time frame, maybe not the one some people expect.
Right. Let's start at the beginning with the prophetic tradition itself.
Okay, so establishing ancient authority, this idea of an unbreakable chain.
Yes, we have to start there. The concept is this continuous line of prophets, this unbreakable chain, as the sources put it. It suggests that from Moses or Musa all the way through to Jesus or Isa and even beyond, there was this unbroken line of figures guided by God who were entrusted with the Torah and judged by it. The Quran itself seems to vouch for the text's integrity during that whole long period.
Okay, let's anchor that. You mentioned a key verse, Surah 5, verse 44. People often cite it for the Torah's divine origin, but you're saying we need to look at the custodianship aspect.
Exactly. The verse starts strong. Indeed, we sent down the Torah, in which was guidance and light. Now, guidance, Huda, and light, Nur, that's powerful language.
It implies clarity, authority.
Right. A text that's corrupted or flawed couldn't really be described as providing divine light, could it? So it establishes the nature of the text.
Makes sense, but then who is using this authoritative text?
Well, the verse gets specific. It says, the prophets who submitted to Allah judged the Jews by the Torah. Now, why is it crucial that prophets used it?
Because within this theological framework, prophets are considered, sinless? Protected from major error?
Exactly. They're the ultimate moral and legal exemplars. If the very text they used to judge their community, the text they upheld, was actually a corrupted human fabrication, well, that undermines their entire mission, doesn't it?
It creates a huge internal contradiction.
It does. It implies that for something like, 1,400 years after Moses, these perfect divinely guided figures were using a broken tool. The internal logic just doesn't allow for that.
Yeah.
So the Torah had to be textually sound during the prophetic era.
Okay, so that really narrows the window for when any supposed ancient corruption could have happened. If it happened, say, 800 years before Muhammad.
Then you have sinless prophets using a corrupted book. It's a theological problem for the person making the claim.
Right, but what happens after the main line of prophets? Does the chain break then?
That's where the verse continues the chain of custody. It says, after the prophets, rabbis and scholars were entrusted with the scripture of Allah and were witnesses thereto.
Okay, but hang on. If I'm playing skeptic here, prophets are gone. Now you've got fallible humans, rabbis, scholars. Maybe this is where the corruption creeps in. How do the sources handle that?
Well, look at the language used. They were entrusted with the scripture of Allah. That term itself implies its divine integrity wasn't suddenly lost just because the custodians changed.
Okay.
And there were witnesses there too. It suggests they were tasked with preserving the testimony of that reliable text. If the text itself had become unreliable, you would still call it the scripture of Allah in this context, would you?
So the custodianship continues, maintaining the integrity of the book into the centuries leading up to Jesus.
Right. And that brings us to Jesus, or Esa. Surah 5, verse 46 is key here. What does it say about the Torah in the 1st century A.D.?
Let me see. It says Jesus confirmed what came before him in the Torah.
Confirmed it. He didn't come to say this book is wrong, throw it out. He confirmed it. That puts another divine stamp of approval on the Torah text right before the Christian era really begins.
Okay, let's pull this together for the listener. If we just follow the Quran's own internal logic about this unbreakable chain, it seems to argue that the Torah was reliable, authoritative, used by prophets and righteous scholars for maybe 2,000 years, right up to Jesus.
That's the internal picture, yes.
Which makes it really difficult to argue that major textual corruption happened way back in the ancient world before Christianity. The window for any such corruption now seems squeezed into those centuries between Jesus and Muhammad, or, potentially, after the Quran started being revealed.
And that's the crucial pivot. That forces us to look directly at the 7th century. What was the state of the Torah then, according to the Quran itself?
Right. So confirmation in the 7th century AD. What does the Quran say about the Torah at that moment in Arabia? You mentioned the Quran claims to confirm previous scriptures?
Yes, the confirmation principle.
Okay.
It's a really significant argument against the idea that the text was already corrupted by then. Think about it. If a book claiming divine origin finds the previous divine book is, full of errors or falsified.
It wouldn't confirm it. It would have to correct it, right? Expose the problems.
Exactly. Confirmation implies that at that moment of revelation in the 7th century, the foundational text being confirmed was considered reliable.
And it wasn't just reliable on principle. The Quran seems to suggest specific key content was still physically in the copies the Jews had then, like in Surah 7, verse 157.
This is one of the most striking claims, really. Surah 7.157 describes Muhammad as the unlettered prophet, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and the Gospel.
Wait, whom they find written? That implies the prophecies about Muhammad were still physically present in the Torah texts held by Jewish communities in the 7th century.
That's the direct implication. It's not subtle. It suggests those prophecies are discoverable in the text.
Let's pause there, because if the Jewish community had corrupted their text before the 7th century, and they were often resistant to Muhammad's message, what's the absolute first thing you'd expect them to delete?
The bits that validate the new guy. Any group wanting to maintain its own identity against a new prophetic claim would surely remove anything in their scriptures that seemed to support him.
So the fact the Quran expects these prophecies to still be found there, that suggests a strong confidence that this key content hadn't been systematically removed.
It argues against large-scale malicious textual changes in the centuries right before the 7th century, at least for content this critical.
So it wasn't just trustworthy for old stories, but for politically charged prophecies too. And beyond prophecy, it was still seen as a functioning law code.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Surah 5, verse 43, gives us this amazing glimpse. It basically asks the Jews, why are you coming to Muhammad for judgment? You already have the Torah, and it contains Allah's judgment.
Wow. Okay, so what there is huge. The Quran itself is acknowledging the Torah as the legitimate, sufficient source of God's law for the Jewish community at that time.
If the Torah's legal sections were fundamentally broken or corrupted, why would God, in the Quran, refer them back to it as containing Allah's judgment? It wouldn't make sense.
And there's a real-world example of this in the Hadith, isn't there? The stoning incident.
Yes, Sahih Muslim 1700. This story is crucial because it helps distinguish between corruption of the text and corruption of practice or interpretation.
Okay, set the scene. What happened when this couple accused of adultery was brought to Muhammad?
Well, the situation was this. The Torah text clearly prescribes stoning for adultery, but apparently the Jewish leadership in Medina had started applying a softer punishment, maybe blackening the face, public humiliation, especially if the guilty parties were, rich or influential.
Ah, protecting the elites.
Seems like it. They wanted to avoid the harsh penalty mandated by their own text. So they bring the case to Muhammad, maybe hoping he'll give a lenient ruling that validates their current practice.
So they weren't disputing the text existed, they were just ignoring it.
Essentially. Muhammad asks them to bring the Torah. They bring it, and reportedly, one of the leaders tries to cover the verse about stoning with his hand while reading. That's the account. But a knowledgeable Jewish convert points it out, confirms the stoning penalty is right there in the text. And Muhammad upholds that ruling, the one from the Torah text.
Okay, that distinction is critical. He didn't say, your book is corrupt, forget it. He said, essentially, your practice is corrupt, but the text itself is correct, and that's the law we follow.
Exactly. He validated the textual command over their altered custom. The corruption here was practical, maybe interpretive, driven by social factors, not textual deletion across all copies. This reinforces the idea that the physical text was considered reliable.
Okay, so reliable prophecy, reliable law code. What about the basic stories, like the history of the prophet?
There's support for that too. Surah 10, verse 94. It basically tells the audience, if you doubt the stories the Quran tells about Moses or Noah, go ask the people of the book, those who have been reading the scripture before you.
So the Quran expects the Jewish scriptures to corroborate its own accounts of these figures.
Yes. It implies confidence that the narrative content held by the Jews was trustworthy enough to verify the Quran's own stories. It establishes the reliability of the earlier text's historical accounts right up into the 7th century.
So if we take all this internal evidence from the Quran and Hadith together, the time frame for any textual corruption seems to have shrunk dramatically. The claim that the Torah was corrupted in ancient times looks very shaky based on these sources alone.
It really does. The focus now has to shift to whether these sources support the idea that physical textual corruption happened during or after the 7th century.
Which brings us to tarif, the word itself. What does it actually mean according to the sources?
Right. This is crucial. Tarif is the Arabic term for alteration or corruption. Now, for many people today, they hear tarif and immediately assume it means tarif bailas, physically changing the words, deleting things, adding things to the actual written text.
But you're saying the sources themselves might point elsewhere, more towards tarif b'mana, corruption of meaning or interpretation.
Exactly. There is significant ambiguity in the key verses used to support the tarif claim. We really need to unpack this distinction because the whole debate hinges on it.
Okay, let's take a major one. Surah 3, verse 78. It talks about a group who alter the scripture with their tongues, so you may think it is from the scripture, but it is not. Why? With their tongues.
That phrasing is highly suggestive, isn't it? Alter with their tongues. It points towards oral distortion.
How so?
Well, picture this. Someone reads the authentic Hebrew text aloud, but then when they translate it orally into Arabic or explain it, that's where the twisting happens.
So they misinterpret or mistranslate deliberately to mislead listeners who can't read the original Hebrew.
Precisely. The distortion happens in the delivery, in the spoken explanation, not necessarily in the physical scroll itself. The meaning gets manipulated to fit an agenda.
Okay, that's a different kind of corruption. Is there other evidence supporting this oral distortion idea?
Yes. There's a relevant hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari 7362. It advises Muslims to be cautious about accepting explanations of the Torah from Jews, specifically mentioning they used to read the Torah, in Hebrew and then explain it in Arabic to the Muslims.
So the warning wasn't don't read their scrolls, they're fake. It was be careful about their explanations when they translate from Hebrew to Arabic.
Exactly. If the problem was widespread textual forgery, the warning would likely be about the physical texts themselves. But the focus on oral explanation or translation strongly suggests the issue, at least in this context, was interpretive or translational corruption, tarif b'mana.
Okay, but what about verses that sound much more like actual writing, actual forgery? Like Surah 2, verse 79, woe to those who write the scripture with their own hands, then say, this is from Allah. That sounds pretty clearly like forging a text.
It certainly sounds like it, yes. But again, we need to look at the context and scope. Is this verse saying that every copy of the Torah was systematically rewritten? Or is it condemning the act of someone writing a specific document, maybe a commentary, a legal opinion, or even a whole new book, and falsely claiming that specific writing is divine revelation?
So it could be about creating new false scriptures rather than altering the existing ones.
That's a very common interpretation among classical scholars. They might see it as referring to, say, non-canonical books or perhaps later rabbinical writings being wrongly elevated to the status of scripture.
And even if it does mean physically altering the Torah, the act of writing something false with their own hands sounds like something happening then in the 7th century or later.
Right. It would point to a specific, localized act of forgery at that time to maybe counter the existing text or support a particular viewpoint. It doesn't support the idea of deep, ancient corruption going back centuries or millennia.
So when we analyze these Tari verses carefully, considering the timing and the specific language,
the internal evidence seems to consistently point away from ancient, widespread textual fabrication. It points towards the Torah being seen as reliable in its written form in the 7th century, with the corruption being more about twisting meanings, dodgy oral translations, or perhaps forging specific new documents.
Okay, so the internal case from the Islamic sources seems pretty strong for textual preservation up to the 7th century. But what about evidence from outside this whole theological discussion? Is there physical proof?
This is where it gets really interesting, because we could step outside the internal debate and look at archaeology. We can look at physical evidence.
You're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Exactly, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Imagine finding this ancient library hidden in caves for nearly 2,000 years, sealed away around, say, 70 AD.
Wow. So completely untouched by any later debates, any arguments between Jews, Christians, Muslims. They were just locked away.
Locked away long before Islam even began. These scrolls date from roughly 200 BC to 70 AD. That's centuries before Muhammad. They give us a snapshot of the Jewish scriptures from well before the Christian era even solidified.
And what did they find among those scrolls? Did they find parts of the Torah?
Oh yes, they found thousands of fragments, including substantial portions of the Torah books, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, others.
And the crucial question, what did those ancient texts look like compared to the Torah text known today?
This is the bombshell. The scholarly consensus is overwhelming. The Torah fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls are extremely similar, often virtually identical, to the traditional Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, that has been used for centuries and is still used today.
Muslims say that the Torah is corrupted since there are variations, and they say that there is a wholesale corruption and that theology is significantly affected to the point that Torah can't be followed as guidance and light anymore. However, after investigating this, most of variations are minor and don't affect the overall theology of the Torah. The evidence does not support a wholesale corruption.
Okay, let's connect that back to the timeline argument. If someone wants to claim the Torah text was physically corrupted, the Dead Sea Scrolls forced them to say that corruption must have happened before the scrolls were hidden away. So before 70 AD, maybe even before 200 BC.
Correct, because the scrolls don't show massive corruption. They show remarkable consistency.
But wait, if the corruption happened before 200 BC, we run right back into that internal problem from the Quran itself, don't we?
You absolutely do. You crash right into the unbreakable chain argument.
Because the Quran says that during that exact period, pre-200 BC, sinless prophets and righteous scholars were using the Torah authoritatively.
Precisely. So the timeline just doesn't work for the claim of ancient textual corruption, whether you look at it internally through the Islamic sources or externally through the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It seems like a logical bind. If the corruption was after the scrolls were hidden, after 70 AD, the Quran itself seems to confirm the text's reliability in the 7th century.
Right.
If the corruption was before the scrolls, before 200 BC, the Quran says prophets were using the reliable text during that time.
It creates a major internal conflict for the claimant. The evidence, both internal to the Islamic sources and external from archaeology, points strongly toward the textual preservation of the Torah, at least in its core form, up to the 7th century AD.
So, the only way out, based on all this, seems to be acknowledging that pillar #1, the idea of ancient, widespread textual corruption, isn't supported by the very sources often used to argue for it, nor by the historical evidence.
It seems that way, which means the whole focus of the discussion needs to shift.
Okay, let's recap pillar #1 then. We looked at the internal arguments from the Quran, the unbreakable chain, the confirmation principle, the examples from Muhammad's time.
And they all seem to point towards the Torah being viewed as textually reliable and authoritative for Jews in the 7th century.
And then we brought in the external evidence, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which provides powerful historical corroboration for the text's stability over millennia.
Right. So if the foundational claim of textual corruption, Taris Balavis, is largely contradicted by the sources themselves and the physical evidence, where does that leave us?
It shifts everything, doesn't it? The debate shouldn't really be about if the text was preserved. The evidence suggests it largely was. The real question becomes, why does the content, especially the stories, differ so much between the Torah and the Quran?
Exactly. The conflict isn't in the grand doctrines, like monotheism or the status of Moses. Both traditions agree on those fundamentals. The conflict, the real friction, is found in the details of the shared narratives.
This is where we pivot from the argument about textual integrity to comparing the actual stories. You mentioned that if both texts are divinely preserved and confirm each other, you'd expect the shared stories to align closely.
You would expect that, yes. But when you actually compare them, they often don't align on the specific.
Okay, this is where you said it gets really interesting. Give us an example. The story of Joseph.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Genesis gives it significant space, and Surah 12 in the Quran is entirely dedicated to Joseph 98 verses. It's a major shared narrative.
Okay. So how do they compare?
Well, according to detailed analysis mentioned in the source material we reviewed, comparing just those two accounts of Joseph, analysts estimate there are something like 941 differences in the specific details.
Wait, 941 in one story.
Over 900 differences. We're talking about variations in things like who exactly came up with the plan to deceive Jacob, the ages of the characters, how Jacob reacted, the precise circumstances of the move to Egypt. Tons of small, and sometimes not so small, narrative details.
That's staggering. Can you give a concrete example of a major difference?
Think about the moment the brothers bring Jacob the bloody coat, claiming Joseph was killed by a wolf.
Yeah, a pivotal emotional moment.
In Genesis, Jacob is utterly devastated. He immediately believes it, tears his clothes, mourns intensely for days, refuses all comfort. It's raw human grief. He's convinced his favorite son is dead.
Okay. What about the Quran's account?
Dramatically different response. In Surah 12, Jacob immediately senses deception. He says something like, "Rather, your souls have enticed you to do something," and he resolves to have beautiful patience, trusting in God and believing Joseph is still alive.
Wow. So one Jacob is crushed by grief. The other recognizes a lie and holds on to faith.
Fundamentally different portrayals of his reaction, his faith, his perception at that key moment.
Okay, so why? Why would, say, the Jewish scribes, if we follow the logic that their text was the original, why would they change Jacob's reaction from faithful patience to utter despair? There's no obvious theological gain there, is there? It doesn't impact the law or major doctrine.
Exactly. What's the motive? Why change over 900 details in the Joseph story, many of which seem theologically neutral? Altering Jacob's personal emotional response doesn't seem to serve any clear political or dogmatic purpose. It's not like denying a prophecy.
So that's the new rabbit hole we need to go down. If the texts are fundamentally reliable, as pillar #1's refutation suggests,
Then why these thousands of narrative discrepancies across all the shared stories?
the conflict shifts from is the text corrupted to which narrative account is the authoritative one.
Precisely. The issue moves from textual integrity to narrative authority. If you have two accounts, both claiming divine backing, telling the same core story, but with hundreds or thousands of detailed differences, which one reflects what actually happened?
So for you, the listener, what does this deep dive on pillar #1 mean? It means you can probably set aside the confusing and often unsupported claim of ancient, widespread textual corruption.
The real action, the substantive area for comparison and understanding, seems to lie in the narratives themselves.
If the texts confirm each other's basic reliability, but then diverge dramatically in the telling of shared history, which version are you meant to take as the definitive account?
That question of narrative difference and its implications is exactly what we need to tackle in our next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.